Okay, so we come to this point in the dialogue at 10a. And 10a is really a turning point in the dialogue, and it has to do with this question. So if you recall, the logic had been, okay, so if holiness is what is loved by all the gods, I guess unanimously, right? Then Socrates says, okay, fine. Let's give you the fact that you could speak intelligently or accurately about what all the gods love. But even so, he says, that doesn't tell me about the nature of holiness. And this question right here sort of changes the path of the dialogue. He says, consider this question. Is that which is holy loved by the gods because it's holy? Or is it holy because it's loved by the gods? Now let's pause here for a second and make sure, we kind of come up for air once in a while to make sure that, we understand what we're doing and why, right? In dialogues like this, in philosophy in general, it's easy to really get caught up in the trees without seeing the forest, right? So keep in mind what's going on here. All we're doing is defining holiness. And so we could ask, well, why? Well, within the context of the dialogue, we're defining holiness because remember, Euthyphro is suing his father in a civic court. This is important. And he's justifying his actions based on being holy, right? So he's saying, I am holy, therefore I'm prosecuting my father. Okay. And so far, obviously then, to define, well, what is holy? So holy means, going against your own father, apparently, seems to be the implication, right? So then obviously holiness is going to be an important principle to define here because it is justifying putting another man potentially to death, right? So let's modernize this for a minute. Let's suppose that, a mother drove her car with the children in the back seat into Lake Michigan and killed them, right? And then when she gets arrested, she were to say, well, the gods told me to do this, or God told me, or Jesus told me, or Allah told me, or whatever, right? What would happen to such a person in America? They would go to jail, is what would happen. Because in a civic court, there's no place for the gods told me to do this. Because remember, in a republic and a civic court, it's about rule of law and evidence. So keep in mind, this dialogue is not like against religion or something, but keep in mind, Euthyphro is in a civic public court, suing his father based on Gnostic knowledge of the gods that only he knows. So this question, though, when he says, is that which is holy loved by the gods because it's holy, or is it holy because it's loved by the gods? Again, this passage sounds kind of like double talk, doesn't it? It seems like he's asking the same thing twice, just trying to confuse him. Not so much. Let's look at what that says. And is he trying to confuse him? It may be confusing to us because, we're not used to reading, well, at this level of detail, right? And these dialogues always invite what we've been doing the whole time, and that is to stop and really think about, well, wait a minute, what do you really mean? But notice Euthyphro doesn't, right? When you come up with one of these, is it loved by the gods because it's holy, or holy because it's loved by the gods? If someone is truly listening to somebody, they would stop and they'd say, wait, I want to understand. What did you mean by that? Right? And ask for further clarification. Euthyphro doesn't, right? Throughout this whole dialogue thus far, he's never asked a question. And, think of your interpersonal, experiences, right? If you ever notice, some people are just waiting for you to be quiet so they can start talking again, right? So this gives us an insight into Euthyphro. We already know he's vain. All he wants to do is talk about the gods, and he is not listening, right? Okay, but anyway, let's look at the question that Euthyphro just asked him. He said, okay, when it comes to holiness, is holiness, 1, loved by the gods because it's holy, or is it 2, holy because it's loved by the gods? Okay, let me switch colors here real quick. No, how do I switch colors? This one. Sorry, whoopsie daisy. You'd think I'd know by now, right? Okay, so we sort of have two items here, right? The loved by the gods, right? And then obviously the holy. Okay. Now the because in English, right? Like literally it means to be caused by, right? Which will help us to understand the difference. And as much as 1 and 2 might seem the same to us, they are absolutely different. Because check it out. In number 1, something is loved by the gods. So this, A, is caused by this, B, right? It's sort of like saying the loved by the gods has been caused by holiness kind of thing, right? So in other words, look at this. In the first one, the love of the gods is caused by holiness. So if that's the case, that means that holiness must exist first, right? And then second comes the love of the gods. That's supposed to be a heart right there, right? Right? Love of gods is second. Because in this one, we're saying the love of the gods is caused by holiness, which means that therefore the holiness must exist, and then the gods recognize it, and then secondarily, they love it. Does that kind of make sense? Notice this one. Holiness is being caused by the love of the gods, right? So in this one, what comes first is the love of the gods, right? That's first this time. And then second comes the holiness, right? So then the holiness comes second. So in other words, what this one is saying is basically there's love of the gods that exists, and then what it fastens itself to, I suppose, or attaches itself to, is therefore holy. Does that make sense? So notice in this one, let me change my colors again. In this one, if we add all this up, what it means is that holiness has to exist first. And if we're talking about this one, the love of the gods exists first. Now, who cares? What's the significance? Well, think about this for a second. If we're going to assume that holiness is loved by the gods because it's holy, and the holiness comes first, then we ask ourselves this question. Well, if what the gods love has to exist first, that means holiness exists in itself, right? So that means the holiness has to be recognized by the gods, which therefore means that holiness has a definition or a nature. Does that make sense? Okay, let's use more concrete examples. Let's talk about cats, right? If we're going to say that cats are loved by the gods because they're cats, versus cats are cats because they're loved by the gods. Notice the first one. So we're going to say, okay, what is a cat? Well, a cat is loved by the gods because it's a cat. Well, that means that the gods would first have to be like, okay, there's a cactus, there's a platypus, there's a scooter. Oh, there's a cat. Oh, man, that's a cat. I love cats. So notice first, the gods would have to recognize what cats are, or, in a dialogue, holiness. So the holiness exists in itself, and it has its own nature. And because of its nature, the gods admire and love it, right? But they have to know what it is first. But notice in the second one, let's use our cats example. So cats are cats because they're loved by the gods. So that would mean that if the gods love something, shazam, it becomes a cat. Make sense? It's sort of like in number 2, this leads to total relativity because whatever the gods love becomes cat, if we're talking about cats. Returning to the dialogue when we're talking about holiness, right? So whatever the gods love then becomes holy. So in other words, their love makes things holy. So that would mean, what does holiness mean? Whatever they love, which could be anything, A, B, C, D. They love ice cream, they love kittens, it doesn't matter. So that means everything they like becomes holy. So in other words, this one, number 2, has no definition whatsoever. Number 1, as we said, leads to an in itself and nature. In other words, an absolute definition. This one doesn't change based on the love of the gods, right? But this one is totally relative to the love of the gods. Now think about this for a minute. If we're Euthyphro, which one would we want? Now keep in mind, Euthyphro is what? He is a prophet guy that tells stories about the gods. He's a guy who is hell-bent on prosecuting his father for some reason that we don't know. And so he also believes that holiness is what he's doing. So if we add all this up, notice that if he buys number two gives him all the power to decide what the gods love. Remember, he had said, oh, I can tell you all these stories about the gods. In the dialogue, he said, I'll convince the jury, etc., etc. So if the priests control what is loved by the gods, then whatever they can convince the people that the gods love becomes holy. So that means in the court, all Euthyphro has to do is to prove, using cool stories of the gods and mythology and all that kind of stuff, all he has to do is prove that the gods love his thing, and then he can prosecute his father. Does that kind of make sense? Now, you add this up and you think, well, in the hands of a politician, any politician, remember, I mean, we're talking, a long time in the past here, but just think of any politician that uses a religious or a non-tangible sort of justification for their actions, right? Like, let's round up, all the Jews because God told me that we should round them up and exterminate them, right? Nazi Germany with Hitler. We should round up all of the people who we think are witches. How do you know we're witches? Well, we'll do this weird stuff, and I know that they're witches, right? Because I've got the special knowledge. If I prick them in a certain spot, they don't even know it, but I do, right? So, I mean, this idea here of, the gods tell me, therefore I can persecute people, is as old as human civilizations. And we're not immune to it either. Perhaps you have heard of unconscious bias of late, right? So unconscious bias is sort of like the same thing here, where you could say, well, you're racist. You don't even know it, but I do, because I have special knowledge, right? Just like the witch hunters or Euthyphro himself, right? When we say, well, I have special knowledge that does not have an absolute nature, right? Because it can change based on how it is loved by whatever's in charge, right? So in the same way, we could say, you might not know you're a witch, but I'm a witch hunter and I've been trained, and so I can't, manifest and prove it. But see this magic spot on your body? I know that means you're a witch. Okay, condemn the person, right? It's ridiculous. Same with unconscious bias, right? So you could say, I'm not racist. But in psychologists, who in many ways are like, you could argue, are kind of like the new Euthyphros, right? Well, based on our special knowledge, right? Because I'm a psychologist, and I've got special knowledge, and I know that you actually are racist. You just don't know. But I do, because I got the special knowledge. This is the whole danger of a guy like Euthyphro, right? And there's more in the dialogue to come, but it's important to think about this at this point. Because, on one level, all these guys are dead, and, this is ancient Athens. But this is a perennial problem in the logic of even today's politicians, right? I mean, this doesn't go. Whoever can speak for the gods can bend people's opinions to suit their agendas. And that obviously is incredibly dangerous in a republic, which is why this dialogue is worth taking our time to understand.